Chapter X. The Follow Me disappears. There had been talk of going through the Cape Cod Canal and so obviating the outside journey, but most of the voyagers thought that would be too tame and unexciting. Besides, a barge had managed to sink herself across the channel near the Buzzards Bay and a week or so before, and no one seemed to know for certain whether she had yet pulled herself out and gone on about her business, and, as Steve pointed out, they'd feel a bit foolish if they got to the canal entrance and had to turn back again. They had fair weather and light breezes all the way to New Harbor, and from there, the next day, around the tip of the Cape to Provincetown. They dropped anchor off the yacht club landing at Provincetown at 4 o'clock Friday afternoon and went ashore as soon as the boats were berthed and sought the post office. Provincetown had been selected as the first certain port of call, and most of the 13 boys found mail awaiting them. Only Neil, however, received tidings of importance, and his letter from his parents brought an exclamation of dismay to his lips. "Anything wrong?" asked Aussie, sitting beside him on the rail of the hotel porch. "Rotten," replied Neil disgustedly. "I've got to go home." "Go home?" echoed the other. "What for?" "Dad's got to go to England on some silly business or other," explained Neil gloomily, "and he wants me to stay with Mother." "Of course I ought to. Mother's sort of an invalid and there's no one else. But it's rotten luck." He stowed the letter in his pocket and stared disappointedly at the passing traffic. "I was having a bully time too," he muttered disconsolately. "That's a shame," said Aussie sympathetically. "When will you have to go?" "He wants me to meet him in New York Sunday. He sails early Monday morning. I suppose I'll have to go tomorrow. Guess I'd better get a timetable and see how the trains run." "Gee, I'm sorry," murmured Aussie. And so, for that matter, was every other member of the adventurers' company, for Neil was well liked. And the Follow He's crew were scarcely less regretful. A study of the railroad schedule showed that the next train for Boston left at 5:55 in the morning and that the only other train was at 2:40 in the afternoon. 5:55's a perfectly punk time for a train to leave anywhere, even Provincetown, objected Neil. "And the 2:40 will get me to Boston too late for anything but a midnight train to New York." "Bother trains," said Steve. "We'll run you to Boston tomorrow in the boat. We can do it in 4 hours or so. If the Follow Me crowd want to stay here another day, we'll wait for them at Boston, or we'll go on and meet them further up the shore." "But I don't want to hurry you chaps away from the Cape," expostulated Neil. "You were going to Plymouth, weren't you?" "Yes, we were, but there's nothing important about that." "Hold on, though. I say, look up the Plymouth trains, Neil. There must be more of them from there, and we can put you across to Plymouth in a couple of hours." They found that a train leaving Plymouth at 10 would put Neil in Boston shortly after 11, in plenty of time for the 1 o'clock express to New York, and so it was decided that the adventurer was to leave for Presentport at 7 in the morning. The Follow Me was to follow more leisurely, and the boats would spend the next night at Plymouth. Neil and Aussie went off to send telegrams, and the others roamed around the town until it was time for supper. Afterwards, Neil packed his belongings in 2 pasteboard laundry boxes, having no bag with him, and constantly bewailed his ill fortune. Later, the Follow Me crowd came over and they had quite a jolly evening, and Neil cheered up vastly. The next morning dawned clear and hot, and, after an early breakfast, the adventurer weighed anchor. The Follow Me's whistle signaled goodbye until they were halfway to Long Point, and the adventurer replied. Once around the point, the boat headed across the wide bay for the mainland at a good 16-mile clip. The voyage was uneventful, and Manomet Hill was soon sighted. Then Plymouth Beach stretched before them, and presently they were rounding the head and pointing the adventurer's nose for the town. There was still the better part of an hour left after the anchor was dropped, and they all tumbled into the dinghy and found a landing and spent the next 3/4 of an hour rambling around the historic town, Aussie and Perry bearing Neil's strange-looking luggage. Neil insisted on viewing Plymouth Rock, declaring that he might never get another opportunity, and after that there was not much time left to them. They installed Neil on the train impressively, stowed his luggage around him, and then took up positions outside the window, where, to the mingled curiosity and amusement of other travelers, they conducted farewell exercises. These included an entirely impromptu and unsolicited duet by Perry and Hun. a much interrupted speech by Joe, and, finally, as the train moved out of the station, a hearty Dexter cheer with 3 kneels on the end. In such manner the adventurer lost her cabin boy and the ranks of the club were depleted by 1. Neil's departure left a hole, and as the others returned from the station they spoke of him rather as though he had passed on to a better world, recalling his good points and becoming quite sad in a cheerful way. In view of their bereavement, they decided to have luncheon at a hotel, and during that meal recovered their spirits. More sightseeing followed, but the day was a hot one and by 3:30 they had had enough and so returned to the landing and pulled back to the cruiser. Steve, who had supplied himself with yesterday's New York and Boston papers, preempted a seat on the bridge deck and stretched himself out on it, his legs crooked over the railing. The others found places in the shade as best they could and talked and watched for the Follow Me and listened to occasional snatches of news from Steve. There was practically no breeze and the afternoon was uncomfortably hot even under the awning. Joe finally solved the difficulty of keeping cool by disappearing below and presently re-emerging in his swimming trunks and dropping overboard. That set the fashion, and they all went in save Steve, who was too absorbed in his papers to know whether he was warm or not. The Follow Me came up the harbor just before 5 and tooted a greeting as she swung around to a berth near the adventurer. The fellows, who were still in bathing attire, swam across to her, and very shortly their ranks were increased by just 6 more. The sight of Steve's feet hanging over the canvas was too much for Perry and he yielded to temptation. Swimming up very quietly he deftly pulled off one of Steve's sneakers and, in defiance of the owner's protests, they played ball with it until the inevitable happened and it sank out of sight before Wink Wheeler could dive for it. Brownie said then that Steve might as well let them have the other one, since one shoe was no use to him, but Steve's reply was not only non-compliant but actually insulting in its terms. He took off the other sneaker and laid on it. That bath left them feeling both refreshed and hungry, and Aussie had a hard time finding enough for them to eat. Perry described the astonishment of some Plymouth fisherman when he opened a codfish some fine day and discovered a rubber-soled shoe inside. You'll read all about it in the paper, Steve, and won't you laugh? He added. Steve, who had been forced to don a pair of leather shoes, didn't seem to anticipate any great amount of amusement, however, and suggested that it would be a gentlemanly act if Perry would hie himself to a store and purchase a pair of No. 8 sneakers, a suggestion which Perry weighed carefully and discarded. You see, he explained, it wouldn't be fair to make me spend my hard-earned money for 2 sneakers when I only lost 1. If the store would sell me half a pair, Steve, I'd make good in a minute, but you see my point of view, don't you? Steve didn't seem to. While they were still at table, Harry Corwin's voice was heard and Aussie investigated by the simple expedient of climbing on top of the galley locker and thrusting his head through the open hatch. He wants to know if we'll go to the movies with them, said Aussie, ducking back into sight. Surest thing you know, agreed Perry. We might as well, eh? Asked Joe. It'll be beastly hot, though. I'll go if they've got Charlie Chaplin, said Han. Aussie, ask him if they have, please. He says he doesn't know, responded Aussie after an exchange of remarks. I told them we'd go, though, he added, dropping to the floor. They're going to wait for us on the landing in half an hour. Half an hour, grumbled Perry. You told them that so I couldn't get enough to eat, you stingy beggar. Got anything more out there? Great jumping geosulfate, ejaculated Aussie wildly. I've cooked 2 messes of potatoes and toasted 100 slices of bread. Oh, all right. Bring on the dessert, then. The dessert's on now, answered Aussie shortly. Cookies and jelly. That's all you get, picky. Won't we have to buy some more grub pretty soon? Asked Steve. Aussie nodded and glanced darkly at Perry. If he stays around we will, he answered. We've got enough for 3 or 4 days yet, though. Better have some canned stuff, I guess. And some flour and sugar. How's the treasury, Phil? Inquired Han. Still holding out. Where's the next stop, Steve? We said Portsmouth, but Harry wants to put in at Salem. I don't suppose it matters much. Then we cut out Boston altogether. Why, yes, it's out of the way a bit. Besides, We didn't start out on this cruise to visit cities. We started out to look for adventures, said Perry sadly, but I don't see many of them coming our way. What do you call adventures? Asked Han. Didn't you have a fine time being lost in the fog the other day? Huh, replied Perry, scraping the last of the jelly from the glass. Being lost in the fog isn't an adventure. It's just plain punk. What I mean is Pirates and desert islands and that sort of thing. You were born 100 years or so too late, said Joe, shaking his head. Toss me a cookie, Han. Thanks. If you saw a pirate, Perry, you'd drop dead. If I saw a pirate, replied Perry indignantly, I'd live as long as you would. Besides, I've got a perfect right to drop dead if I want to. Go ahead, said Joe lightly. Anytime you like, old chap. The reason I spoke of Boston, reverted Phil, was that I thought it might be a good place to buy our supplies. There's no use paying any more for them than we have to and going broke before the cruise is half over. Yes, but don't forget that gasoline's pretty expensive stuff these days, Phil, said Steve. I guess we'd burn up enough gas getting to Boston to make up for any saving on supplies, eh? I suppose there are stores in Salem. Thought it burned up a while ago, said Han. Part of it did, but I don't suppose it stayed burned up, you idiot. What time is it? We'd better beat it for sure. Righto, agreed Han. I hope they have Charlie Chaplin, though. By some strange inadvertency, however, Mr. Chaplin's eccentric person was missing from the screen. In spite of that, though, Han managed to enjoy the evening. Afterwards, Perry suggested light refreshments and they set out in search of a lunch counter. But anyone who knows Plymouth will realize the hopelessness of their search. After roaming around the quiet and deserted streets and at last being assured by a policeman that their quest was worse than idle, they went back to the tenders. I suppose, said Perry disgustedly, they close all the stores early so they can go to the movies. I wish now we'd had some soda at that drugstore where the man had insomnia. We've got food on board, said Aussie. I'll fix up some sandwiches. I wish you'd get enough to eat for once, though, he added as he took his place in the dinghy. Don't they ever feed you at home, Perry? Huh, I'll bet you're as hungry as I am. What are they yelping about over there? The other tender had left the landing a moment before the adventurers' boat and now its occupants were heard shouting confusedly across the moonlit water. Can you make out what they're saying? Asked Steve of the rest. Just nonsense, I guess, answered Phil, tugging at his oar. Stop rowing a minute and listen, Steve directed. Now then. Something about the boat, murmured Han. I can't make it out, though. By Jove, I can! Exclaimed Steve. The follow me's gone. She must have slipped her anchor or dragged or something. Row hard, fellows.